For 26 years, Margaret Doyle had given everything to Harrington and Cole Insurance. She started as a filing clerk at 22, back when the office still used typewriters and carbon paper, and worked her way up to senior claims analyst, a title she'd earned through nights spent poring over policy documents long after everyone else had gone home to their families. She loved the work. She loved the quiet satisfaction of untangling a complicated claim, of finding the detail everyone else had missed, of making sure that when someone lost their home to a fire or their car to a flood, the company treated them fairly. It wasn't glamorous work. But it was hers, and she was good at it, the best in the department, if she was honest with herself, though she never said so out loud. Margaret wasn't the type to boast. That quiet humility was exactly what Denise Whitfield exploited. Denise had joined the department 6 years ago, fresh out of a business program, all bright teeth and brighter blazers. She was 31, ambitious in the way that made older employees uneasy, and possessed a particular talent that had nothing to do with insurance claims. She knew exactly how to make herself look good in front of the people who mattered. At first, Margaret didn't mind mentoring her. It was standard practice, the senior staff trained the new hires, and Margaret took pride in passing on what she knew. She showed Denise how to spot fraudulent claims by cross-referencing repair estimates. She taught her the shortcuts for pulling historical data. She explained, patiently, the unwritten rules of negotiating with adjusters who tried to lowball policyholders. Denise absorbed it all with wide-eyed gratitude. "I don't know what I'd do without you, Margaret," she used to say, squeezing her arm. "You're like a work mom to me." It took Margaret almost 2 years to understand what was actually happening. The first sign was small. Margaret had spent 3 weeks untangling a suspicious claim involving a warehouse fire, the kind of case that looked routine on paper but had inconsistencies buried 3 layers deep. She found that the damaged inventory listed didn't match the company's own shipping records from 4 months earlier. It was meticulous work, the kind that saved the company nearly $200,000. At the quarterly review meeting, Regional Director Frank Sabatino stood up and praised Denise's brilliant catch on the warehouse fraud case. Margaret sat in the 3rd row, hands folded in her lap, waiting for the correction that never came. Denise, 2 seats away, ducked her head in practiced modesty and said, "Oh, it was a team effort, really," which was somehow worse than if she'd simply taken full credit, because now Margaret's silence looked like agreement. She told herself it was a misunderstanding. Frank was busy. Maybe Denise had mentioned Margaret's name and it got lost in translation. She let it go. But it kept happening. A cost-saving process Margaret had designed to streamline claims intake, the one that cut processing time by nearly a third, appeared in an internal newsletter under the headline, "Denise Whitfield's Innovation Boosts Department Efficiency." Margaret's name wasn't mentioned once, not even as a contributor. When Margaret spent a weekend rewriting the training manual for new hires, incorporating a decade of hard-won knowledge about fraud patterns, Denise presented it in a meeting as something I've been working on to help onboard new analysts. She'd changed the font. That was it. That was the extent of her contribution. Margaret began keeping records, quietly, methodically, the way she approached everything. She saved emails. She timestamped her work. She started sending brief status updates to her own supervisor, Carl Jennings, just so there'd be a paper trail. Carl, a soft-spoken man nearing retirement himself, would nod sympathetically when she mentioned her frustrations, but he never intervened. "Denise is very good at self-promotion," he said once, almost admiringly, as if that were a virtue rather than a symptom. The turning point came during the Pemberton case. It was the largest claim the department had handled in years, a commercial property dispute worth over $4 million, tangled in conflicting appraisals and a policyholder who was, frankly, trying to defraud the company by inflating losses from a storm that had done far less damage than claimed. Margaret worked the case for 6 weeks. She drove out to the property herself on a Saturday, on her own time, and photographed structural elements that contradicted the claimant's engineering report. She tracked down a subcontractor who admitted, off the record, that repairs from an earlier, unrelated incident had been folded into the current claim. It was the kind of case that made careers. Margaret knew it. She also knew, by then, exactly what Denise was capable of, so this time, she didn't just email Carl. She documented everything in a shared case file with timestamps, CC'd 2 other senior staff on her key findings, and made sure her name was attached to every substantive document. She thought she'd covered every angle. She hadn't counted on Denise going over everyone's head. 3 days before the case was set to close, Denise requested a private meeting with Harrington and Cole's vice president of claims, a distant, rarely seen executive named Richard Okonkwo who visited the branch office perhaps twice a year. Somehow, Denise got 15 minutes with him. Margaret only found out because Denise's assistant, a nervous young man named Toby who genuinely liked Margaret, mentioned it in passing. 2 weeks later, at the company's annual recognition dinner, an event with actual plaques, actual applause, actual regional press coverage since the company sponsored a local charity gala alongside it, Richard Okonkwo took the podium. "I want to recognize an outstanding piece of investigative work," he said, "on what may be the most complex fraud case this office has handled in a decade. Denise Whitfield, please come up." Margaret sat frozen at her table, her husband Gerald's hand tightening on her knee under the tablecloth. He'd come to support her. He'd heard about the Pemberton case every night at dinner for 6 weeks. He knew, better than anyone besides Margaret herself, exactly whose work was being applauded under someone else's name. Denise walked up in a red dress, accepted a crystal plaque, and gave a 2-minute speech about trusting your instincts and not giving up when the data gets messy. She thanked her assistant. She thanked her cat, as a joke, to laughter. She did not thank Margaret. She did not mention Margaret's name once. Margaret clapped along with everyone else, her face arranged into the pleasant neutrality she'd perfected over decades of professional life, while something inside her went very quiet and very cold. That night, Gerald wanted to call the VP directly. Margaret, who rarely raised her voice in over 30 years of marriage, told him no, firmly. "If I fight this the way you want me to fight it," she said, "it becomes a shouting match about who said what. She'll cry. She's good at crying. And I'll look like a bitter old woman who can't share the spotlight." She stared out the kitchen window for a long moment. "I need something she can't argue her way out of." So Margaret did what she'd always done best. She waited, and she watched, and she built her case. It took 4 months. Margaret discovered, through careful and entirely legitimate means, mostly by simply reading things Denise left open on shared drives, and by noticing patterns Denise herself was too careless to hide, that Denise's talent for taking credit came paired with a much darker habit. She'd been quietly approving expedited settlements for a handful of claims that bypassed standard verification steps. Nothing dramatic. Nothing she'd get arrested for. Just small, repeated shortcuts, a rushed sign-off here, a skipped inspection there, that happened, curiously, to correlate with a specific outside contractor. The contractor was Denise's boyfriend's cousin's company. Margaret didn't say a word to anyone. She simply started pulling the relevant claim files. She had every right to, as senior analyst, and cross-referencing dates, signatures, and approval codes. She built a timeline. She noted every instance where Denise had personally fast-tracked a payout to this contractor's clients, skipping the secondary inspection that company policy required for any claim over $15,000. It wasn't personal vengeance dressed up as diligence, or at least, that's what Margaret told herself, and mostly believed. It was simply the same rigorous work she'd always done. The fact that it happened to be Denise's negligence this time was, Margaret reasoned, almost beside the point. Almost. She compiled everything into a formal report, clean, factual, utterly without editorializing, the kind of document that couldn't be dismissed as an emotional grudge. 14 instances of skipped inspections. Total exposure to the company, nearly $90,000 in potentially inflated payouts. A clear financial relationship between the contractor and Denise's personal life, easily verified through public business records. Margaret did not take it to Carl, who she suspected would sit on it out of conflict-averse habit. She did not take it to Frank Sabatino, whose fondness for Denise's flattery was well known. She requested, through proper channels, a meeting with the Internal Compliance Office, a department so rarely used by claims staff that the request itself raised eyebrows. The compliance officer, a sharp, unsentimental woman named Priya Anand, read through Margaret's report in real time during their meeting, her expression unreadable. When she finished, she looked up and asked only one question: "Why are you bringing this to me instead of your director?" Margaret considered lying. She considered saying something about proper procedure. Instead, she told the truth. "Because I don't trust anyone in this building not to protect her." Priya didn't smile, exactly, but something in her posture eased. "Understood. Leave it with me." The investigation took 6 weeks, conducted with the quiet thoroughness that Margaret recognized as a mirror of her own methods. Priya's team pulled every file Denise had touched in the past 18 months. They found more than Margaret had, including 2 instances where Denise had personally overridden a junior analyst's fraud flag on claims tied to the same contractor. When the findings were presented to senior leadership, there was no crystal plaque, no applause, no speech about trusting your instincts. Denise was placed on administrative leave within the week. 2 weeks after that, she was terminated, not with the drama Margaret had half imagined, no security escort or raised voices, just a quiet exit through the back stairwell on a Tuesday afternoon, a cardboard box of desk plants and framed photos in her arms. Margaret happened to be at the copier when it happened. Denise looked at her once, something calculating flickering behind her eyes, as though trying to determine exactly how much Margaret knew and whether she was responsible. Margaret said nothing. She simply held the elevator door. "You did this," Denise said quietly, not quite a question. "I did my job," Margaret said. "The same job I've always done. You should try it sometime." She let the doors close. The aftermath unfolded slower than Margaret expected, and in some ways, more satisfying. Richard Okonkwo, the same VP who'd handed Denise her plaque, called Margaret into his office personally the following month. He didn't apologize outright, executives rarely do, but he asked, with visible discomfort, whether the Pemberton case findings had, in fact, been entirely Denise's work. Margaret laid out the timeline calmly. The dates of her site visit, her interview with the subcontractor, the internal emails where she'd flagged the discrepancies weeks before Denise ever mentioned the case in a meeting. She'd kept everything. 26 years of being underestimated had taught her to keep everything. Richard sat back, rubbing his temple. "This should have come to me sooner." "I tried the normal channels," Margaret said, without bitterness, simply stating fact. "They didn't work for someone like me. They worked fine for someone like her." The company issued a quiet but formal correction in the next internal newsletter, crediting Margaret directly for the Pemberton case and 2 other major findings from the prior 2 years. There was no dinner, no plaque, no applause. Margaret found she didn't mind. She'd never wanted the spotlight. She'd only ever wanted what was hers to be recognized as hers. 6 months later, when the senior claims manager position opened up, a role Denise had been quietly angling for before her termination, Margaret was offered it without having to apply. Carl Jennings, easing into retirement at last, told her over coffee that it was long overdue, which Margaret privately thought was one of the great understatements of her career, but she thanked him graciously anyway. She heard, secondhand, through Toby, that Denise had taken a job at a competing insurance firm 2 towns over, and that within a year, a similar pattern had begun to surface there too: flattery upward, credit stealing sideways, corners cut just enough to avoid real scrutiny. Margaret felt no satisfaction in that. Some people, she'd come to understand, weren't stopped by a single consequence. They simply moved to a new stage and performed the same show for a new audience, until an audience finally stopped clapping. What mattered to Margaret was smaller and more personal. It was walking into the department each morning knowing her name was attached to her own work again. It was training new analysts, genuinely training them, the way she once trained Denise, and watching them build real skill instead of skill at performance. It was Gerald, the night she got the promotion, pouring 2 glasses of wine and saying, 26 years. "I always knew they'd have to see it eventually." "They didn't see it," Margaret said, smiling for the first time in months. "I made them look." She'd learned something in the whole ordeal that she tried, afterward, to pass on to every young analyst who came through her office, something she wished someone had told her 30 years earlier: quiet, honest work is worth doing for its own sake, but it will not protect itself. Sooner or later, you have to be willing to gather your proof, choose the right room, and say the truth plainly, without apology, to the one person who can actually act on it. She never raised her voice once through the entire affair. She never spread rumors, never confronted Denise in front of others, never did anything that could be characterized as petty. She simply did what she had always done: meticulous, patient, unglamorous work, and let the truth, properly documented and properly delivered, do what flattery never could. It held up.